Hello and welcome once again to DOSBox Demystified. This is part 5. We're going to be talking about cycles, CPU cycles, and settings today. In terms of CPU options, DOSBox has quite a few here. It's capable of emulating 386 and 486 processors more precisely, but all of those methods are slower than just leaving it to auto. So the core and the CPU type, I would say leave those at auto unless you're trying to do something specific, something advanced. So we're not going to go over the other options today. The cycles are the speed of the CPU. More cycles is more faster. But the trick to this is determining how many cycles does a game expect. If you set the cycles too high, the game might run impossibly fast, or you might get weird options like your Sound Blaster sound is squeaking and squirking because it doesn't know the rate at which it should be playing the samples back, that sort of thing. You can set this to a fixed number, which you should. There's also options for max and auto. Your mileage may vary on that. But I like to set a specific number so that we have a specific cycle count. If you've got a game that's particularly finicky with the speed, you can cycle the cycles up and down with Control F11 and Control F12. The options here determine the spread of each time you push that button. How much is it going to cycle up or down? You can set those to your liking. So where do we start? What cycles do we choose? Usually old vintage hardware and games, they talk about things in terms of megahertz, not in terms of cycles. So I've got listed here a selection of popular CPU types that were used. Intel was the dominator back then, and of course they made more than 6 CPUs in those 20 years. There's hundreds of different CPUs, but I made sort of a checkpoint of 6 different CPUs throughout the 20 years that you can use as a guidepost when you're trying to figure out your cycles. In this case, the image there is asking for a 286 or better, which means that we probably want to beat 12.5 megahertz worth of cycles. But then again, we have the question of how do we convert megahertz into cycles? And the short answer is that you really can't do it directly, but you can get close enough. So here's a table, and this data is straight from DOSBox's developers. It's got the CPU checkpoints, it's got the year those CPUs were around, their speed in megahertz, and the equivalent-ish cycles in DOSBox. As you can see from the graph, just because something is twice as fast doesn't mean it needs twice as many cycles. The relationship is a little bit funkier than that because different types of math that processors were capable of, with earlier processors being incapable of floating point math in particular. So it's not just a direct one-to-one how many cycles. There's a lot more variables than that. This particular table was invented by testing, where they would run benchmark software inside DOSBox and see the result and then compare it against actual hardware. Of course, this isn't an exact science. It's just meant as a guide. So if you have a program that is sensitive to speed, this might get you a place to start based on what the game is expecting in megahertz, and then you can dial it in from there. Alright, so switching gears a little bit here, we've been talking about configuring the actual machine that DOSBox is emulating. Now we're going to talk about setting up the software for use on that machine, and usually that's done through configuration programs. Games will come with them. They're the easiest way to configure your game because it basically will come up with a menu and let you pick the options that you need. When you're doing this in DOSBox, of course, you'll execute the setup program as if it were a game. So you want to use your configuration file for that game when it's already configured for the sound options and so forth that you need. Usually it's named setup or install.exe. And when you run one of these, you're going to want to run it under the same configuration that you intend on running the game under, because a lot of times they will automatically detect things like sound blasters and so forth. So if you've got everything set up the way that you want it on the DOSBox emulation end, then the setup configuration tool end will fall into place a lot of times. Now, all these configuration tools are pretty similar to one another. There's 3 different examples from 3 different game companies there. They're pretty easy. You just select it from a menu and it saves into a configuration file. There is some weirdness from time to time, though. In particular, Thunderboard and Pro Audio Spectrum, which you might see around. Those are basically just Sound Blaster clones. DOSBox does not emulate them, so just pick Sound Blaster instead and you'll get basically the exact same experience. DOSBox does support extended and expanded memory, so if you get questions about that by the installer, say yes, I want to use that. DOSBox does support joysticks, but the support for it is a little bit fiddly and finicky, and it's an advanced feature that I will go over later. We're just doing the basics at this point. And Sound Blaster, it has technical settings, which is basically telling the computer where to look in hardware for it. DOSBox emulates that on the default. You can go in and change all this stuff, but out of the box, it's always 220.7.1. Those are the defaults that just about every game is expecting anyway, so you can usually just push enter and click through those numbers because they'll be auto-filled in for you most of the time. Of course, with thousands upon thousands of DOS games out there, they're not all bound to use the same method to configure their technical options. Some of them ask for a configuration when you launch it. Those would be pretty self-explanatory. You just pick the option that you want to use. A lot of times they'll auto-sense your hardware. That's why it's important to set DOSBox to emulate the kind of hardware that you want first so that the program can auto-sense it for you. And a lot of games will use command line switches. That's where instead of just typing the executable file, you'll follow it up with a switch. And to find those, you usually have to use the game's manual to find out what the switches are to set it the way that you want it. But a lot of those games actually will auto-sense as well if you just launch them by their executable. A good example of that is LucasArts games. They are auto-sensing, but you could override them with command line switches. Well, that'll about wrap it up for this time. What are we doing next time? We're going to learn where to get some more games. We're going to talk about the legality of game copies and copyright, abandonware, and all that stuff. We're going to learn how to take control of GOG and Steam purchases that use DOSBox. And we'll take a look at physical media and if you should use that or not. I'm still a bit of a YouTube noob here. I think everything's improving. But if you think I did a good job, give me the like and subscribe. Maybe leave a comment. I hope this worked out for you, and I will see you next time.